All right, welcome back to the Business Roundtable Podcast. I am super excited. I've got two amazing guests on the podcast that I've had the opportunity to work with, both of them over many, many years. And really excited to have both Angela DePaoli and Geraldine Aron here. Women that have made just a mark in the environmental consulting space that I've spent most of my career, and just excited to have them both share about their journeys as women business owners and working in the environmental consulting space, and just sharing a wealth of knowledge. So on behalf of the Business Roundtable audience, I want to welcome you, Angela and Geraldine. Thank you so much for joining me on the podcast.
Absolutely. Thanks, David.
Absolutely. So I will say, actually, I got to meet Geraldine first before I met Angela. Even though Angela and I worked at a previous company together, our times kind of missed each other. And then I worked with Geraldine, not at the same company, actually. Geraldine, we worked with you at your company, Paleo Solutions, at the time that you had founded years ago. And I'd love to just start with you, Geraldine, just a little bit about your background, what you've done, and your kind of as a business owner, a little bit about your company, you're working in the environmental space, just so our audience gets to know a little bit more about you.
Thanks, David. It's been quite a history with you. My history with Angela is much more recent, but probably a good thing.
And it's so cool to hear you guys compare notes. Yeah, that's why I wanted to have you both on the podcast. Absolutely.
Yeah, so I founded Paleo Solutions in 2004. And I used to work for a small company in Orange County that was bought by a middle-sized company. And the writing was kind of on the wall from the management that they had brought in initially, where a friend of mine we both started Paleo Solutions, Scott Armstrong and myself. But we kind of saw the writing on the wall where our clients weren't showing up to meetings. I mean, our new management bought us was not showing up to meetings, and we're just like, God, that doesn't seem good for business. And before they bought the small company we had worked for, it was armed to be Paleo. I don't know if you remember them, but they had offered us to buy their company before they actually sold it to all the employees. And just the people that were at the table, it just wasn't going to work out. So it kind of planted the seed for Scott and I, like, oh, you know what, maybe we can do this on our own. And when we saw how poor management was kind of standing up our best clients, it just felt like natural to kind of maybe take a step forward. I was actually terminated from that middle-sized company because they said I wasn't doing my job, but I can guarantee you that wasn't true. But it was the best thing that happened to me, because it really pushed the envelope for Scott and I to put a business plan together and kind of get the funding to start Paleo Solutions. And so, I did transition Scott out as a business partner, and then eventually Paul Murphy. And then we had a brief stint with somebody else as a partner for about 8 months that didn't work out. But so there's a little history there of Paleo and our partners. But I did manage Paleo Solutions for 17 years. And it took me, and then sold it to Stantec. And it took me about 2 years to transition the company. And I had a contract to stay on with Stantec for 2 years with an option to stay employed afterwards. And I wanted to take a sabbatical to see what the next steps were. And so far, I'm still on my long-term sabbatical. I decided to actually get off their payroll last year after my first year of sabbatical and kind of stay retired. So I was mainly a mitigation paleontologist. And we started off only providing paleontology, and then eventually added cultural resources. We started out with 3 people, myself, Scott, and Angela knows Maria Espinosa. So she was my first employee at Paleo Solutions. Stayed with us really until we sold the business. So I have about 25 years of experience in mitigation paleontology in the environmental consulting world. And I took the company from about 3 people to 60 employees. Although we lost quite a few employees during the acquisition, which, as I learned, is quite normal. Can't take
Yeah.
it personally.
No, we've had other guests in the past that talk about mergers and acquisitions and things like that, and maybe we'll even touch a little bit more about that on the podcast. That could be probably a whole episode in and of itself, for sure.
Yeah, and I think as we probably get more into this conversation, certainly as I got more into running the business, I moved farther away from probably the hands-on work that I really enjoyed in paleontology. So kind of, end up doing a lot more admin and project management and HR, all the stuff I did not go to school for.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. No, I definitely want to get more into that and understand that. So, I mean, so you came from working as an employee, Geraldine, to the point where you're like, no, I could step out on my own. I could give this a go and create something. And I think why I like having folks like yourself and Angela on here is that people can know that there's a journey here. I was just, stepping out and trying new things and learning it along the way, and we make mistakes, and how do we, it's a journey, and it's not necessarily a destination. It's just a way of going and a way of living, and creating the life that you as best you can. And it sounds to me like you've created a pretty good life for yourself. You've navigated ups and downs and creating this space now where you were at a successful company and now on sabbatical and deciding what's my next, adventure in life,
I'd say just living life right now.
There you go. That's an adventure right there, especially in our age and day and time, we find ourselves in here.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, I just connected with somebody local in Bend, who's part of the Central Oregon Geology group. So I'll probably start doing some outreach and going to schools and things like that to make sure kids stay interested in science. That's really important.
Absolutely. Super, super important. So, Angela, how about you? I wanted you to share a little about your journey too. We've kind of got Geraldine's journey from being an employee and starting Paleo Solutions for 17 plus years and going in that transition. And we're going to get more details in there, but just for the backstory for folks that want to know a little bit about your journey and how you came to found Bargas and where you and I intersected.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So my degree is in soil science. And so when I first went to school, I just assumed that I was going to end up in either the USDA or, I assumed it was going to be a federal position. And then when I went to get my master's degree, that's when they had just come out with stormwater pollution prevention plans. Nobody knew what a SWIP was. And so I was doing a study for the state of California as far as my master's thesis. And then the funding got cut and Google had just come out, really. So I remember Googling SWIP and job, and it came an ad for a consulting firm where we had worked, David, and they couldn't believe that they found somebody that knew what those were, and I couldn't believe I found a job. My parents couldn't believe I found a job also, and so that was when that's when I found out about consulting, and I really enjoyed it. It was a bit different. They were mostly a biology firm, so getting into stormwater was new for them, and they were just building the department. And so what I really liked is that my supervisor at the time was she was a woman. She had a great, background, a lot of business sense. So she had come from owning, or her parents had owned a business growing up. And so she had a huge entrepreneurial spirit that I hadn't seen before. And so it was fascinating to watch her grow a department and do that piece. And so my time there, it was great, and I really enjoyed it. But I also then got an opportunity to start doing more project management while I was there. So I got out of doing just stormwater plans, and then I really enjoyed the project management. So I liked all of the negotiating. I liked trying to get both agencies at the table and the project proponents, and bringing in all of the different disciplines, from the biology and the cultural and all the other pieces that came into play. And so then that was really the direction I had went. And then that was right around 2007 and 2008. And so we started seeing things shifting a bit. And I was leaving a meeting one day and with the Army Corps, and that's when somebody approached me from the Corps and said, "Hey, have you ever thought about working here?" And I hadn't. I had never really had given it a lot of thought. And then my colleague that I had worked with, she kind of mentioned, if you maybe worked at the Carr, maybe you did that for a couple of years and we could start our own thing when you got out. And I was like, interesting seed. And I hadn't really thought about that. And my experience at the firm that we were at was I saw a lot of great women that were never brought up into their leadership positions. So they had, they weren't given the same bonuses, they weren't given the same opportunities. And so that's what really led to our conversation. And then I honestly just got lucky. I was leaving right around the big crash and huge changes in the development world, and ended up in the Army Corps. And worked in regulatory for a couple of years, and then went into civil works. And that's when I really got into project management and then I, a little less like Geraldine then, I did not have this real big push to maybe start my own firm. I started getting calls from developers that I'd worked with when I left regulatory, and they said, hey, could you do a wetland delineation? Could you do some 404 permitting? And when I went to Office of Counsel at the Carr, they approved it and said, yeah, you're not in that department anymore. So I thought it was like a side hustle. I thought it would be this like extra. And then a year later, I realized I had 2 jobs and was, working 90 hours a week and couldn't keep up. And so then that's when I left my position at the Carr and decided to give Bargas a go. And then that was when, there was a lot of fear, I know, in my family. I mean, they were not a proponent of it at all. They were kind of like, you have a great government job. Why would you do that? And then I went, well, I know I'm employable. So if it doesn't work, I'll come back. And so, here I am 13 years later, and it's still working. So, those are the things. And so, but I think then there's a lot, back to, you touched on it, David, not knowing, and Geraldine, you touched on it too. Like you go to school and you learn these disciplines and that really well, but
yes,
business side is not taught. I mean, I don't have an MBA, I have a master's in soil science. It did not prepare me for business ownership. So you're learning both at the same time. And
absolutely,
the level of client management changes drastically, of course, with ownership and really then learning what your AR really means, and that it's not like getting a paycheck and it's real until they actually send you the check, versus your paycheck's real on every other Friday. A different approach, but that's how I ended up owning Bargas.
Well, I think I love hearing both of your stories and your journeys, and we want to get more into this, because one of the things I really appreciate about Angela getting the opportunity when I was working with you at Bargas was and I think both of you, Geraldine, I want you to speak to this too, but you as a woman business owner, I was not familiar with North American Women Business, the organization NABO, which you were a part of, and the president up in Sacramento, and there's a lot of great resources there. And one of the reasons why I started Even Steward Your Business is because I wanted to be able to come alongside and help other business owners and their teams, and realize that if you try to do it all by yourself and you can't be successful just trying to do it only on your own. But it's finding other organizations, and the two of you have now talked and connected and supporting each other. So just maybe I'll start with you first, Geraldine, but just kind of talk about your journey as a business owner, and like what have you learned along the journey of like leading, finding other resources, because sometimes you feel like we have to know all this stuff, but we don't know all this stuff, like but we feel like maybe I've got to hold this together. But what I found on the Business Roundtable podcast, particularly having all different voices come in here, is sharing like, I know this slice of the pie, but I don't know this, and I know this, and I need to bring in other people to help me along the journey. Maybe just talk about that, Geraldine.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question, because I always felt like, oh gosh, maybe I needed this business degree, and along the lines, what I really learned was maybe I needed a psychology degree, but that's a different story. But really, I mean, as my company started growing, I started doing mentor protege programs with other large companies, and that was probably one of the first big steps. Since we were a disadvantaged business and woman-owned business. There were great programs through transportation contracts that we could be mentored by larger companies. we were mentored by ICF, one of them who was one of our best clients at Paleo Solutions. And I learned a lot because they shared just any kind of trouble. I went to them with some bullets and agendas of things that I wanted to address internally in my company and how they dealt with it. So that was kind of my first insight, like, oh, it's really great that our good client is willing to share a lot of confidential information with us. It also helped strengthen the relationship with that client. But at the same time, I learned some valuable just, hiring techniques on staff and how to hire better personnel or, just different things that I went there. Also looking at finances, like Angela had brought that up. And I think from there, I realized it would be really nice as we started growing. There was a lot of growing pains internally. And you, as an owner, you take this stuff personally because it's like, these are your children, these are your babies. And it's like, even though you have no relationship to these people, you want your company to operate like a happy family, essentially, right? And so some of the growing pains were bigger than I could get through just even in a mentorship program, even though that arm was always there even after the program was finished. And we also did one with Helix too, and that was also very valuable. But the next step that I did was I started going to 10,000 small businesses, and that was with other CEOs and entrepreneurs. And I think what I realized there is that a lot of my problems in the business with staff and growing pains were pretty normal to other companies. I just didn't know that because I was looking internally rather than externally. And my peers were my staff, which they're really never your peers when you own a business. So that's one of the first lessons I realized was like, oh, it's really nice to talk to other CEOs and have a shoulder or an ear to lean on and get input of their challenges and struggles that they had gone through. So I just recognized that I didn't have to always feel like I had to reinvent the wheel anytime there was something that I was troubleshooting with, and not just employees. These are like project management, growing pains, financial growing pains, like how to implement all these things. And I recognized that it wasn't going to come internally until I got external input, and I didn't have to start my own research project every time there was an issue, because companies have gone through this time and time again, and having that support from other CEOs was probably one of the best lessons I learned. And from 10,000 small businesses, once I finished that program, it was like I think it was like a 10-month program where it's like every week, every month you're going and you kind of put together a new business plan. So it was a great way for me to kind of look internally where I was and where I wanted to go. And once that program ended, I joined Vistage, which also was another CEO roundtable that gave me other valuable insight from different types of CEOs that I had been exposed to 10,000 small businesses. So I felt like it was a huge eye opener for me to be finally around my peers and people that could understand some of the challenges I had gone through just kind of growing a business. I think, and why I say psychology over a business is I learned that going through these programs, a lot of my intuition is innate, and I don't need a business program for it. Maybe I would have benefited from certain language and finances that I could have been, just a new vocabulary that I could have had the right terms for. But I recognized that a lot of my intuition was far more valuable than what I would have actually got out of a business class. But the psychology and what makes people tick now, that's something I realized that I'm like, if I would have known maybe I was going to run a business, I would have paid a lot more attention in college to my psychology class.
Well, just to that end, Geraldine, I mean, that's part of the reason why I created Steward Your Business. And even when I was working with Angela at Bargas, I recognized my strength was a little bit more on the people side. And there's different areas and people have different strengths of systems and processes. And it's not bad or good. It's just a matter of getting everybody in the right spot, right? And I think both of you, what I know of both of you, you're both visionaries. You're both people that could see something in the future, what could be. And it's not that I think some people come to that more naturally than others. And so I think that is a gift of seeing what could be, what you guys have created, and people catch on to that, and they're like, I want to help you do that. Don't ask me to create the vision, but I'll help you implement the vision, right? And so that you guys were be able to see that. I call it the pioneer voice, but somebody that's charting ahead, creating the path, right, for people to follow behind you. And that's one of the things that drew me to when I came to Bargas, because I saw what Angela had created in the platform that she said, and I could step into this space confidently, and I was really appreciative of that. I think a lot of people that are not business owners and have maybe more an employee mindset, I'm not saying this derogatory, they just don't understand what has gone in. There's just a lack of awareness and understanding what it took to get you to this point, into this place, all the energy and focus. And like you said, the investment of time, Geraldine, like you said. And I want business owners to hear this, because sometimes they say, oh, I don't have enough time, or it's going to cost me some money or whatever. It's like, but that, what you said, not being alone, having perspective, understanding, and not being isolated, I think is to me, especially as a business owner now myself, is really refreshing and encouraging, and helps me keep going, when things are tough.
Yeah, and just before we transition, Angela, on this time factor, I mean, I can tell you from where I am now versus where I was. I mean, you basically end up working 7 days a week, whether you like it or not, and your brain is always turning, because you take the risk, whether it's financial or any troubleshooting personnel issues in companies, and these things, or making sure your clients stay happy, and these things keep you up at night all the time. So I feel like it was a 7 day a week job that, now that I'm not working, it took my brain like 3 months for me to stop dreaming about work and thinking about work. So, wow. I mean, it is something that really consumes you when you own the business, because you can't just go home and turn it off. If something happens after hours, it comes back to you to solve those issues. So the time factor, it's like, Angela could probably do the math better than I can, but sometimes you make pennies on the dollar, right?
Oh man.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's the point that sometimes is missed. I think there's a perception of just like, well, the getting time away, or recognizing, I think your vision is what pulls you forward, and through the other challenges that you face. And I think that, David, is one of the biggest things that I learned with you and I, and working together, because when we stopped working together, there was a kind of this unspoken, yet David and I think we spoke about it a lot, with where David's strengths were. And I really did lean on those for him, where he built the team and created the connections. And, my strengths have always been in finance, and, kind of looking at the bigger picture piece. And it's not that I'm missing something, because it takes the team. So we don't all have it all. And I think that's the impact that it can have, is when you're starting to put your team together. If you have some folks that are, well, I am the best, and I'm the best at this, and I should be the best at everything else, all of a sudden your team stops working together to maybe build that same vision. And so I do know that has been something that, now that I'm seeing and going through transitions of leaders within the company, and kind of where, you can still have your vision for your company, but how it can be impacted and sometimes even derailed by certain folks that have a different vision, but came along onto your ride for a totally different reason that you weren't as clear. And I think, back to Geraldine's point, that being around other business owners sometimes just helps you formulate your vision a little bit better, makes you understand that, other folks do have those same problems. But your problems are sometimes unique for yourself too. And, and in growth and how you grow. So I think, David, we had two experiences when we worked together. It was huge growth, keeping that growth, keeping up with being able to bring enough talented people. And then all of a sudden you find that there's new problems. And I think that's the biggest thing that I've learned in business, is that every time you almost have to have a stomach for just problem solving, because there isn't I've solved this and now I've got 3 weeks with no problems. Just keep coming.
Yeah.
And I think that that's something that I have found now in asking and working with, new leaders and starting to look at what, kind of the next phase of Bargas looks like. It's asking more, what's your appetite for, for having to be the problem solver, being the person that you come to and you don't know how you're going to solve it. And sometimes it can feel, insurmountable. And I think that is where the business groups or, having business coaches, all of those things become very helpful, because sometimes somebody's already gone through it. Or, sometimes too, and, Geraldine, you can, of course, share your story on what it was like to go through a sale, but all of that is, you don't know it until you know it. It's kind of like, you don't know what a broken arm feels like until it's broken. And then you're like, oh, I remembered. There's those things that, and then, it heals and you move on and you kind of go, well, what's next? And then the next time you're kind of like, oh, that's actually not that big a deal. So I think those are big pieces in any type of leadership growth also, is that I think that is what I find is setting apart. I think if folks like not, to not have a lot of change, I think, and again, back to the team, and you need all of our personalities in the world. You need them as part of companies. That's a huge component, but you also need to ask fish to climb trees. And you have to not try to push somebody into management or leadership. And I'd say that one of my biggest misunderstandings in growing a business was because I was like, well, of course they want another opportunity. Of course they want to take on that next step, because I wasn't given that opportunity at the first firm that I worked at. But that isn't always the case. And I think that getting clear with folks on what they want and what their path looks like, and then making sure you really have some, folks that, enjoy that leadership piece, and because each phase of growth is going to have just a whole new set of challenges. And
I want to touch base on that, Angela, and maybe you could have you talk about this, and then Geraldine, because you're 10 plus years successful. I mean, you that's pretty successful business the last 10 plus years. Both of you have been able to do this. And Angela, I remember when I came and started working with you in, I think 2018, I think one of your goals was, I want to make $1 million in revenue. At least that was one of the goals. Like, I want to do that. Right. And so there's a business life cycle, and there are certain things that happen along the life cycle. Like, so you said, so that is one thing. And then, but getting at 2 million, 3 million, 5 million, whatever, there's different problems that occur along that. And one thing that I found with you, and Geraldine, you have to talk about this too, is that we kept having to, at that point in the game, almost resetting our roles and responsibilities about every 6 to 12 months ish, of like, okay, well, there's new issues and new things, and now what I was doing previously, I got to pivot from that, and I've got to move to these new problems. And so, in the environmental consulting space, or any younger business, I would say, that's in that kind of growth spurt, and sometimes it can be done in a shorter period of time, it just depends, but having to be aware of that and adjust, like you're saying, Angela, and again, not being insular, like what you said, Geraldine, looking outside of yourself, whatever that might be, whether it be Vistage or 10,000 businesses, or talking, Angela and you and I at the time, we had different consultants that were coming in and guiding us and perspective that us, just how important that it was, and to continue to look for support outside of yourself along those journeys, and again, to find out what's working, what's not working, what do we keep that's actually really healthy and good, and what are the things that we need to let go of. And I think I'm reading this great book right now. You guys might have read it, 10x is easier than 2x, but this idea of letting the 80% go that won't get you to the next 20%, that next level that you need to get to, right? And having a team that comes alongside you. And that's my passion, you guys know, as Steward Your Business, is like building that leadership team underneath you. Because what I found, and you guys could speak to this too, is as I've done this and talked with more business owners, they can feel almost like they've created a prison themselves, not by design. They didn't want to, but they've created that for themselves, because now I'm stuck and I haven't built a team that can take and carry the vision on for me. And really, how do I do that successfully? So maybe I'll start with you, Angela, a little bit of talking about the journey, kind of something as you talked a little bit about it, and then come to you, Geraldine, about the life cycle of the business.
Yeah, I think those are, as far as there are clear revenue steps. And it's so funny because I was talking to one of our current leaders at Bargas about it yesterday, and I was joking because some of the challenges that we're having now, one, I couldn't even fathom them at $1 million. And then the problems that I had at $1 million, I was teasing like, man, I'd love to go and talk to them. I'd take those problems today, but it was perspective and experience, right? So once you experience it, and I think that is why, endurance sports is a good example of that too, because you don't always know, and you try it and you get scared at first, and then all of a sudden you're enjoying the fear around it, and then you're, and I think that's some of that piece of it, and that's where, and David, we talked a lot about that. We both enjoyed outside, but just collaboration on other ways that we could do it, so that we aren't just seeing it the one direction that we believe that it is. And it's interesting that I find that's a mindset as well, and having folks that do that, and and as you go into transitions, I think that I know for me, I've always wanted to see an expansion in leadership at Bargas, and have other folks come in, and that's when Geraldine's talked about having partners and things like that. That has always been something that I've wanted to look at, like, what does expanding it look like? But then it also has to have the right, appetite for business ownership. You shift from knowing for sure you're going to have a paycheck every 2 weeks to possibly having to take a line out on your home to make payroll for everyone else. So just those things shift. And again, you have to believe enough to know, we're doing the right things. We're protecting both our finite and, resources, and that those are the things. And even just in ones that aren't, as far as those, it's just important to kind of keep in mind, like, what the business does as a whole. And then how do you make sure that you can take care of the people that are working with you? And so all of that, kind of changes. And I think that that's the piece where I've always tried to increase and have additional benefits, and making sure that we have some of that piece. But then I have to have people at the firm then that also do the nurturing piece that's needed as well. So I think sometimes as leader, they expect folks to do all of, that leader must do all of those pieces. And that isn't the case. That isn't fair to ask one human to do anything, just like you wouldn't ask your staff. So I think that's a lot of what I found with, the different sizes, the expectations from leadership. I think that also the changes also from, what you do from coming from the field and managing projects is very different when you shift your role into more of that executive space and having to manage the firm finances or your department finances, and manage the people that are now managing the people that are doing the work, and do they have everything they need, and all of the safety parts and components, because you're now managing risk. You're not managing the project. So that shifts. And as you grow, you need more manager people to kind of manage the teams and growth. So.
Absolutely. Yeah. Geraldine, what about your journey of the life cycle of the business there?
I just wanted to touch on what Angela finished off on, because I think, she had talked about giving opportunities to people and bringing people into management and all those things. And I think something that is challenging across, especially consulting in the environmental world, is that you have these really smart scientists, and they go into this field because of their passion. But what we've all learned is the way to move up is you end up in management, right? And you move farther from, per se, the technical work that you used to love or be passionate about, or digging up fossils, or being in the field as a biologist. And so I think that's something that becomes very difficult, because somebody wants the growth, the opportunities, but putting them in a management position isn't always the right direction. And it gets much harder with a smaller firm than a large firm, because in a small firm, you end up wearing a lot of different hats. No matter what level in the company you're at, you end up crossing some boundary. And I think in a bigger firm, if you wanted only a technical trajectory, you can go that way. And I find a smaller firm, it's much more challenging to keep folks just in technical, especially if they want that trajectory to move up. And I think consulting has done a huge injustice sometimes in promoting people to their point of what I was saying, the Peter principle, right?
Peter principle, yep.
And it's not that person isn't capable or smart. It's just that was the only trajectory up, and now they're not as successful.
Absolutely.
Because of how the industry moves people up. So it's just something that I've learned and definitely observed as a small business owner that was really challenging, is taking these really smart people and putting them in these other positions that they really weren't well trained for. And I know Angela had done an excellent job of sending people to project management programs and things like that. So she definitely took initiative. And I did that through some of our mentor protege programs that we had participated, but still, like, some people are really good at just working away and doing their reporting, and that's happy. But now you add the managing a person, or you add the finances, and it's a whirlwind sometimes. So.
No, absolutely, Geraldine. And it's interesting because now I've got to work with other business owners, and I have a gentleman that does a completely different business, and he has salespeople, and they're really good at sales, but then you promote them to sales manager, and they're struggling. They're struggling with that. So management is a totally different skill set. I agree with you. And some people are better suited or adaptable or coachable than others, right? And then you have the management, and then on top of management, then I had to learn this years ago, even before I started working with Angela. There's a difference between management and leadership as well, and that's a whole another thing, right? And so.
Well, I think that's a good point. I think that folks can see themselves as great managers and have great rapport with their staff, and then they'll struggle with the leadership piece, or they're not coachable. And so they sometimes see that there are opportunities to create good relationships, or that they built teams, but it has to go both directions. When you're in management and in leadership, you have to be able to kind of do those two pieces with it. And I think that's the piece. And I also have learned, in really recognizing that it is 100% okay, and in fact a good thing, if you are clear that you want to stay on the technical track. That is fantastic. I think sometimes then too, folks then say, but I want to also make these other salaries, or I want to move up. And I think some of the challenges with that are that comes outside of your 40-hour work week. Those are because you're keeping your clients happy, you're planning and doing all these other things outside of that time. And I think that that's something that gets missed. You can offer a work-life balance for many of your staff, but at the leadership level, you're always doing something different. So back to what Geraldine said, it's my job isn't, I've not had a 7 day work week, and I don't know how long. And that's okay from, a certain space, and it works for some people. And I think that's when people also need to recognize that it might not work for them.
Well, and maybe both of you guys can speak to this too, because I think there's and this is not right or wrong. It's just a different mindset and understanding of kind of a transaction, like transactional versus this mindset. And one of the things Angela, when I came to work with you, was this give before you get model. Like, I want to create value. I want to participate. I want to give. It's not transactional. And there's a lot of people that are just like, I'm going to do my little time, and that's okay. I'm going to do my check-in, check-out, and they want to set in that space. It's just being really clear if that's, but you sometimes people, like you said, Angela, are kind of torn, like, well, I want this, but I really only want to, and this, but at the end of the day, I just want to be transactional. I want to account for my 15 minutes in and out. And if I'm going to charge you another 15 minutes if I have to, whatever. Right. So it's a tit for tat thing, instead of saying, like, how do we help each other? And so maybe just speak to the mindset of how, somebody that, you guys have seen be successful in your minds from moving up from a technical manager to leadership. Where have you seen that mind shift, understanding? Geraldine, you want to start first, or just thoughts there?
I think you see a mind shift when you get the right person, the right leader in place, and they recognize that all of a sudden there's a team that they're responsible for. And when that team works and it's a well-oiled machine, it's a very good place, I think, for that leadership. And I think they recognize when that's in place and that's moving, how valuable their leadership role is into making that happen. But sometimes to get that machine that well-oiled, it takes a lot of effort, a lot of understanding. I felt like even for when I was at Paleo Solutions, we did some strategic planning to really change and get people more into middle and upper management responsibilities and leadership responsibilities. And sometimes you have to be vulnerable and listen to things that you don't want to hear, and it can be very difficult. But I think if you're able to overcome that vulnerability and step aside and listen, a lot of times you can make some pretty big strides with your team and the step forward. Because when we did the strategic planning, and this kind of ties a little bit in the trajectory of the business. Well, I mean, the environmental consulting industry has been a challenge for, I would say, at least 5, maybe going on 10 years to find staff, right? And the staff that you need at the level that you need it, because our industry has been really, really busy with regulations, construction, meeting infrastructure needs, all of those things. So, and we saw a huge uptick in work, but there wasn't an uptick in the number of people available. And when we went through this strategic planning to allow more people to take on those leadership responsibilities, we actually saw an increase in productivity without changing staff. So there's something to be said if you can make that transition to the right people at the right time, and the people that they're with and how they work together. So I think it's a tough topic, but it's possible, but it could take one wrong person even on that team to kind of derail the whole thing as well. I think we've all heard the saying, right? Hire slow, fire fast. And I think one of the worst jobs I ever had to do is fire people. And I don't care. It never got easy, no matter what the situation was. However, if somebody is derailing a team, sometimes you do have to take these extreme avenues to kind of re-steer and correct the ship, put the ship back on course.
Absolutely.
And I think, to the point of it only taking, one or, just a couple people that derail it, and I did take a different route than Geraldine. I, have brought in business coaches for the year, for years now, and trying to get a leadership team to gel and work well together and to benefit from that shift when you get a great and well-functioning leadership team.
Yes.
And what's been interesting is that, David, you and I had a lot of synergy when we were working together, and then we started bringing other folks in. And it's interesting now, and looking in hindsight, of what those questions would have been, as far as this is what we're seeing leadership as. This is our mindset, because it's back to the technical piece. It's so hard to find these technical experts, and then I believed, well, if I bring in coaches, I can teach them the leadership piece or the management piece. And that in some cases isn't, it wasn't fair, and maybe they thought, that they wanted it. And I think that the more open you are to being coached, and the more open you are to having those hard things, like Geraldine said, reflected to you, so that you can continue to keep improving. And that's where, I've even seen a shift in, maybe the coaches I've worked with, or the team that I've worked with. And then the other thing now that we're finding with our team now is that we meet once a month in person, and we wouldn't be as close as we are now had we not started to make that investment, because working together to solve all of these challenges that we have, and to now bring in the different perspectives, so that you're back to now looking at what is the best way we as a leadership team can solve these problems, versus a blaming kind of victim mindset that it is just the person at the helm on why we crashed. And so it's, I think it's an interesting place to go to, just to use a sailing analogy. Like if it is just the person at the helm, and it's actually like, no, you need a crew, because if you're about to crash the boat, there's a lot of work to be done to stop the boat from crashing.
Absolutely.
Vendors out to help, or are you going to just point at the person at the helm and say, I hope the wind goes the right direction? So those are things that, when people are going to, maybe if they're watching this and aren't in leadership and yet have wanted to be in leadership, it's, recognizing that your job shifts quite a bit, and knowing the technical is important. But like what I found in working with you, David, the ability to grow a team, and maybe having more technical experts as a part of your team, if it's not the space that you're coming from or an ability, is something to look at as I think people are trying to grow firms. So.
Yeah. There's a colleague there's a book here, hiring for attitude, or hiring for people that are coachable, that appreciate that, that can, like you're saying, Angela, I mean, people can learn certain skills. And of course, sometimes, we all need those. We need those folks. Absolutely. No doubt. But, working collaboratively, understanding how we can appreciate all the differences, I think is super important. I think both of you have spoke to, the strategic planning, which not everybody does, but looking at these things and again, casting the vision. And it's not just one time, it's an ongoing thing. Like you said, Angela, it's not like, oh, we're just going to meet once a year and that's it. No, it's like every month or whatever the frequency is, to continue to remind people this is what we're about. I feel like the companies that get this and really it's infused in their culture, you see how healthy that is. To me, unfortunately, when you see there's unions have been around for a long time, and they serve a purpose, but ideally, you don't have to go to war and have this antagonistic relationship with your employer if you can, see the greater vision, and we win together, as opposed to us against you. You're this side, we're this side. It's like, to me, that's not a way to run a business, not a way to run a life, but there's a mindset. You have to have a mindset shift of understanding, right? Is this where we're going to win together? Or is this like you're winning, I'm losing kind of a thing? Geraldine, you want to comment on that?
Oh, yeah. I think, David, like a point you bring up, which is something that I experienced a lot and very surprised. And I think oftentimes people view you because you're the CEO and you're the head of the business as this like scary person. And what I've found in my career is how unfortunate it is that people were not willing to always come and talk to you and just have a conversation. And those conversations when you open that door for a conversation, what can come out of it is amazing. Whether like you end up being in alignment with that person or not, but rather than somebody making an assumption and just walking away, I find more often people were too scared, unwilling just to come knock on the door and say, hey, I need to have a chat. And here's what I'm thinking about with my career or where I want to go. Because the last thing I would ever want is for somebody to be unsuccessful. And that doesn't necessarily mean working for me, or, if their success comes from somewhere else, I'm going to be super positive and promote that. Even if they were my employee at the time, because to see that person grow and become successful is way more rewarding than for them to not be able to open that door and talk to me. And I feel more often that people were like, oh, well, I didn't think I could, or you're always too busy. And that's not true. You make time for things that are really important, and people were always very important. So I guess I think it's just, I say that because, if I could just shed any of my knowledge, is go talk to your supervisors, go talk to your bosses, and don't be afraid to have those conversations, because you might actually be really surprised what could open up as a possibility, rather than thinking you have to leave this company or change your situation.
You could be a part of the solution.
Absolutely.
Yeah, exactly. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I know, Angela, back when I was working with you, there's a lot of self-imposed stories. I think even I had to learn that, as I would say, like you do, they like, hey, I'd be happy to talk with you. And no, they wouldn't take the initiative. And so because they said, well, you're like you just said, Geraldine, you're too busy. I'm not important. These are their stories. I wasn't saying this, right?
Exactly.
And then along those stories they can say, well, you don't really care, or whatever these narratives are, right? Instead of like, why don't we get to the reality that let's come together to seek out. We may see things differently, but at least have the conversation and have the opportunity to get at the truth, rather than kind of staying in these silos.
Yeah, the outcome may be the same, but you never know unless you have that conversation.
Never know unless you exactly. Yeah. I know we're gonna have to do another episode. I know we're coming close to the end of the time here, but I want Angela to give we talked a lot of different things here, but I liked your and I'm gonna come back to you one more time, Geraldine. But as we're wrapping up here, just some things that a key takeaway or thought, Angela, that you wanted to share to whether you're a business owner, whether you're an up and coming leader, just something that, hey, in your journey as a woman business owner developing Bargas, that you would just say, hey, if I could share this gold nugget with you, this would be, really important, and just kind of consider it, and come back to you, Geraldine. But just, what's something that's just been really meaningful, even just recently, possibly, that just says, hey, keep at it. Here's something that I've really learned along the way of your journey.
Yeah, I think it's going back to that you're on a team, right? So
Mm-hmm.
if you don't like the team or you don't like the coach, then go and talk about other ways that you might be able to do some of the approaches or the plays. And I think that's what Geraldine was touching on. Go in and talk to people, because it's in conversation, and it's much more challenging these days. Ever since COVID, companies are not in the same location. So you have a 2D conversation, and you shut your computer down, and then you go and tell somebody else what that conversation was about. So yes. I think the biggest nugget I have is something that I heard. If you're not willing to say what you're about to say to the person you're talking about, then you really need to check yourself on whether or not you're saying it, because you really can put in seeds of negativity into your environment and others' environments if you're not really trying to work together and to kind of talk. And I think that's what I have found in leaders, is that true leaders are able to have those candid conversations with each other, have them to each other, even when it's hard. And they're not running around and having siloed conversations and backdoors, because it'll erode a team faster than you can. It's easy to burn a house down, and it's hard to build it.
Yes. Great. Thank you, Angela. All right, Geraldine, here we're in the last couple minutes here. What last nugget that you'd like to share with our audience?
I think the things that I love the most about running a business was the learning curve is exponential. Considering my degree was in geology and my master's geology with an emphasis in paleo, but the learning curve was exponential, which I kind of valued, because it always kept me on my toes. It kept me willing to learn and be open-minded to new things. And being adaptable and the ability to change as the environment and the world changes. So I think those are things that I took away from running a business. I find that a lot of employees don't like change, especially if you make that change for them. But I think if you really want to run a business and you like excitement and you like learning, there's a lot to learn.
There's a lot to learn. And so we're going to have to come back and put a pin in it, because there's still a lot more to learn. And I'm so grateful for both of you being on the podcast here. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Angela. Thank you, Geraldine. Thank you for all listening to the Business Roundtable podcast. We really appreciate those of you that are liking and subscribing and following us along on the Business Roundtable podcast. We will definitely have you both back, because there's a lot more still to unpack. So I just want to say thank you again for being on the podcast here with me.
Yeah, thank you, David.
All right. Thank you so much. Thanks, everybody, for listening. Have a great day.